Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earle. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearle.com. In today's interview, I interview my grandpa, Dr. Ralph Earle. Dr. Earle is a noted family therapist, psychologist, author, and lecturer. He is past national president of the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy and is an approved supervisor for the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. He is a national authority on sexual addiction with over 50 years' experience working with sexual problems and works extensively with sex offenders. Dr. Earle is an ordained minister and served on the board of directors of the Interfaith Sexual Trauma Institute of St. John University, Minneapolis. Lastly, he's the founder and president of Psychological Counseling Services in Scottsdale, Arizona. So without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Ralph Earle. Will you start off by just explaining to our listeners what you mean by the psychology of hope?
Well, Andrew, I know that in my own life and what I experience in other people's lives is that hope is a huge thing. First book I ever wrote was for Simon & Schuster, and the reason I was asked to write it is a friend of mine who wrote a book called Hope, published by Simon & Schuster, suggested that I do one in another area that we call sex addiction. That hope, the fundamental thing that for me as a person who has had two professions, my first one being ministry, all the time I was minister of a church, the biggest thing that I wanted for people in the congregation was to experience more hope in their lives, whether it be individually or coupleship or family, or for that matter, hope for the world in a big picture. And when I went to graduate school, I thought I would stay as minister of a church, and found out when I was working on my PhD that I could do the counseling part full time. And that's what led me to decide that part of ministry is the part that I'm most passionate about. And I really think that's where I have a skill set in areas more than interest or a skill set in building an edifice for a church or other areas that to me were not as important as helping others to have hope that their life was meaningful, purposeful, and understanding how to make their lives more hopeful.
And so what does this look like in terms of your practice? I know you've been practicing for, how many years have you been practicing as a therapist?
Well, as a therapist full-time since 1970, so it's a long time.
Yeah.
Started August, middle of August in 1970. An interesting thing about that, Andrew, is that my first thing I did was start a counseling center in Phoenix area that was called a Pastoral Counseling Center. And we put together a program where it was funded by 19 churches and had state and federal mental health resources that were used. And the first day that I opened up the door to see a patient, my schedule was full from the middle of August to the next February, because the need was so great. This was in Scottsdale, Arizona, and there was nothing in a program like that at that time. And from day one, that what I call ministry, meaning no longer minister of a church, but ministering to people through a counseling avenue, a major emphasis was what when I was a minister, it's called the theology of hope, and then now psychology of hope, or positive psychology. Is that way of looking at helping people has been fundamental to what we were doing. And to answer the question, Andrew, in terms of how that plays out in the practice, it's there are a number of ways. It's one, literally every time I see a couple for the first time, and sometimes it's with one spouse in the office and the other somewhere else in the world on the phone. I ask them during that time to tell each other what it is that they like or love about each other, no matter how broken the relationship is. And in family therapy, which is my favorite modality, actually what I did my PhD in was family therapy, that at the beginning of a family therapy session, we'll always ask each one of the patients to talk about what he or she likes about the family in order to provide a base from that to deal with the brokenness in the family.
And so how does that help with that work around the brokenness?
Well, it's if let's say that if it's a couple and they're in what frequently happens in couples therapy, as I'm sure you're aware, Andrew, and many listeners would be aware, is that there's frequently a cycle of retaliation that happens in marriages. It's my belief that all marriages develop some kind of a rut along the way. Research in the field of marriage and family talks about the fact that the number one time relationships go downhill is when people get married. And I believe in marriage, but anybody that says marriage isn't difficult isn't really understanding what's going on if they've been married for a while. So the breaking that rut that can be caused by just taking for granted birth of a first child, work, so many other things that are demands on all of us in our daily lives, that what usually, if not always, happens is at some point the marriage begins to be taken for granted and other things become higher priorities in the moment than the marriage. And when that happens, then the courtship phase is over, and what some people call the honeymoon phase is over, even if there ever was a honeymoon phase in the marriage. And then painful things begin to happen. So then it's so easy for people to lose hope. It may be that the guy or the woman, or if it's a heterosexual, if it's a gay or lesbian couple, both men or both women begin to be upset and say this isn't working, saying it to themselves frequently, and maybe they're successful in their business or profession. And this gulf begins to develop where work is easier than the marriage, which takes work in terms of keeping it well. And people begin to give up. It's my belief, Andrew, that most divorces are divorces for wrong reasons. So one of the things that we regularly do at PCS is ask, one of our mantras would be that we hope that a couple does not get divorced for wrong reasons. And if they experience hopelessness, despair, that can so frequently lead to estrangement and many times divorce.
And so that shift of just starting right off the bat of, okay, well, what are some affirmations about the relationship, affirmations about the other person that really helps start things off in a positive direction?
Yeah, it really does help. And by the way, when you say affirmations for the coupleship, another thing that we do at PCS regularly is ask individuals, because it takes couples therapy requires individual growth, and always on both sides. There is no perfect person in a marriage. At least I've never met that kind of person. We've had people we've had some grandiose narcissists that have said that basically said that when they get into couples therapy, they begin to figure, they know their partner doesn't agree with them, and frequently leads to a lot of conflict when somebody says, like, you're the whole problem, I'm not the problem at all, which is why couples therapy got started, is not to have an identified patient and to look at the coupleship. When we also have individuals do affirmations. And the way we do that is to have somebody say as many positive things about himself or herself as is that person's age. So in my case, it'd be 82, be a lot of affirmations, and usually have them in group setting, go around the group and take one person at a time and look at that person and say, I am, and then they would say a positive thing, like I am. Well, a biggie is when somebody says, I am worthy, when they haven't felt worthy inside. Or I am intelligent, I am good to others, I'm a good friend to have, whatever they are. So when in couples therapy, when both individuals do the individual affirmations, and then also do the affirmations about what they like about the other person, that provides a base upon which things can be built. It may not lead to them staying married. One of our major things, again, is not wanting somebody or a couple to get divorced for wrong reasons because they haven't given the relationship they're in the best shot they can give it.
So I'm curious, what was it personally for you that led you to marriage and family therapy specifically, opposed to other modalities, and then this orientation, positive psychology, and this psychology of hope that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think personally, one of the things was that realizing how my wife and I, Glenda, my wife and I, needed help in our own marriage. It was definitely a part of that, in terms of that we needed to get help, and we went for premarital therapy. We got married in 1958. In 1956, we did premarital therapy with a guy who actually later became the chair of my PhD committee in another city, and it was helpful. Another part of it, in terms of personally, is that the field of marital therapy and family therapy was in formation and new as an entity. Before that, had been individual therapy or psychoanalytic therapy, and so I was blessed to be involved later on in my studies and as a therapist with people who got the field started. But I think the big thing would be knowing how much in my marriage, my wife and I have been married 61 years. If it weren't for marital therapy and family therapy, I don't think we'd be married now. So that's a big part of it. And then just over the years, new techniques being developed to help the field to be even more helpful. But from the very beginning, or in my own life, it was understanding and learning to love myself more and care for me more, and then us as a couple having more respect for each other, and then working with others, realizing that the individual growth is essential. So at PCS, we spend a lot of time helping people work through traumatic events in their lives, and everybody has trauma, and that's a specialty that we have, not unique at PCS, but specialty we have in helping people to take whether they're what we call big T's, big traumas, or little T's, to work them through, so that it's like damage control, so that they no longer control a person's life in the present, which can be devastating individually and in couples and in families.
What I'm curious about some examples of how you've seen that work around trauma. What have you seen people? What are some steps that you've seen people take to overcome that trauma personally? so that it doesn't have such an influence over their lives and their relationships.
Sure. I'd be amiss if I didn't mention one of the persons on our staff named Marilyn Murray, who is a trauma expert, who she's my age, so she's older now. But when she was 8 years old, she was gang raped, and out of that trauma came the necessity for her to get help, and her help led to her coming up with theories in terms of how to help people in trauma. So, to be specific, we have everybody who comes to PCS do what we call a trauma egg, and that comes from Marilyn Murray. And so they list on in a big circle. Actually, and listeners, this can be a helpful thing to do if it's and I believe if done, needs to be shared with the therapist, because just looking at it without having somebody outside of themselves help them to go through it would might not be wise to do. But have a trauma egg that goes from the very first traumatic event up through the present. So if it's a couple that we're seeing in couples therapy, the way it's helpful is to realize how the trauma of events in the past lead to the way we react to our partner in the present. And another thing that we have everybody do, Andrew, is a genogram, which has been around even longer, so that looking at family of origin issues that can so much affect the current relationship. Let's say if somebody has a mother issue, then if it's a guy, then he may have similar issues with, if it's a heterosexual marriage, with his wife. And that happens in almost every marriage, every family. So to, first of all, ferret out and look at what are those events, and to do some understanding and working through. We have incredible techniques, Andrew, now, as I know you're aware, that did not used to be out there. So areas that we call EMDR and kind of therapy that deals with trauma, gets back into those events, psychodrama, and where people can actually take a lot of the sting out of it. Another thing that comes to my mind is that we frequently have people write letters to their parents. So when we see adult patients, and the letters sometimes are no send letter and sometimes are sent, firing their parents as parents, which can say, if they do, I love you. However, you're no longer my parent. Because one of the big things in psychology, as you're aware, is what we call individuation. And there are people who get married and still haven't individuated from their parents at all, and that does not work well in a marriage.
Sure, that's a really interesting idea of writing that letter, and you said firing, right? Firing your parent.
Well, there's a guy named Don Williamson who was the president of the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, and Don wrote he wrote that letter. His parents lived in Ireland, and he published it in a Marriage and Family Journal. And I don't know if his parents knew that he published it. And the key word is firing. So we frequently do ask people to fire their parents as parents. It doesn't mean they can't have a relationship with them. It's another way to look at the same dynamic is to have it be an adult as opposed to a parent-child relationship. And what happens so frequently is that the parent-child relationship stays fixated at a parent-child state, and then when somebody gets married, or even if they're not married, a single person who still is functioning as a child, or the parents are wanting to treat the adult as a child, the letter states, I fire you as my parent or as my parents because I am an adult and want to have an adult-to-adult relationship, and sometimes says, if we can't do that, I'm not going to be around you much.
Hmm. And I'm wondering, like, what are some of the experiences clients have had after doing that? Like, what are some of their senses after
Yeah,
writing that letter?
that's a great question. It runs a gamut. Another thing we do, actually preferable to that, is if we ever can have the family do what we call family of origin therapy. We do that. And that means, for example, for years, if I'm seeing somebody, if the parents come to town or live in town in the Phoenix area,
Mm-hmm.
or can fly, or will fly in, we'll do a family of therapy, a family of origin session, which is at least 3 hours long, and look at the dynamic face to face. So we're talking about it. The response and what happens does vary. Sometimes, most of the time, it leads to some healing, because it's my belief that most people in the family would rather have healing than to continue no healing.
Mm.
However, there are times when most frequently then it'll be the parents just say, no way, that never happened. No, we have a good relationship. You're not respecting me. When I say that, I think of my son Marcus, and who is the clinical director for us at PCS and does a fabulous job. He and I, on Father's Day years ago, in two different churches, two services each Father's Day, we were the sermon. And this is many years ago, and the topic was what fathers and sons need to talk about. So here was my son Marcus chose the scripture that I agreed, and the scripture was how children should respect their parents. And the theme that we used was that real respect means being truthful with parents, not not being silent or do what I say because I'm your parent. And I remember that was powerful for us, for my son and me, who became in each of the services tearful, and then especially it seemed like especially for a lot of the men in terms of dealing with themselves as fathers or how their fathers had treated them. It's an incredible dynamic when it comes to parent children to have changes occurred, and so that's something personally that I know that he and I still work on, and will need to work on as long as we're until I either die or I'm not senile anymore. And that dynamic. The deal is that there's tremendous hope for improvement when people decide to work on it. So for your listeners who haven't worked on relationships they're in, which by the way happens a lot, many marriages never get worked on. They divorce. To first of all try to improve things in the relationship that they're already in, because it's a great proving ground for growth to occur. And then if improving the relationship leads to a divorce, then probably a divorce makes sense.
Sure. So you were mentioning that truthfulness, bringing that truthfulness into your relationship with your parent or family member. What are some moments that you've experienced with people in your work where there's been that truthfulness shared, and you've seen a move in a positive direction?
Well, a biggie in our practice at PCS is people who've had affairs. So in marriages, because one of the areas we specialize in, and so what we call full disclosure. that means full disclosure. And that means if it's somebody who's had an affair or affairs, telling it. And by the way, when we have people do that, both spouses are prepared for it. The person doing full disclosure as well as the other person who will receive the full disclosure. And we always recommend that there be one or two therapists in the room when that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's one of the most painful things for people to handle, to be betrayed that way when partners had an affair. Is coming back from betrayal is mammoth. So otherwise, there was a book entitled called People of the Lie years ago. There's a lie that can be like cancer in a relationship. So we, again, guided by a therapist, having people do full disclosure is something that I bet happens at least once or twice every week at PCS. Somebody doing that. And when people get radically honest, and if there's remorse on the part of the person who had the affair, genuine remorse, what we call victim empathy, then that almost always leads to healing in the relationship. And then the other partner, what I tell people is that when they're working on those kinds of issues, they're doing premarital therapy, even though they're already married. Because, Andrew, very few people actually do any premarital therapy before getting married. That's very rare to actually do therapy. They may go some classes or do some what we call counseling, but they want to get married. And it's after getting married, I call it premarital therapy, because either they're going to have a better marriage than highly likely they've ever had, or it sometimes leads to the end of a marriage.
So I was curious about your own marriage. How many years did you say you were married?
61 years.
61 years. I'm curious what are some things that you look at that account for being in a marriage for 61 years?
Okay, well, I'll speak about our marriage then, since you're asking. Our marriage is 61 years. When we got married in 1958, I wasn't ready to get married. I didn't know that, by the way, and neither did my wife know I wasn't. She discovered I wasn't ready to get married after we got married sooner than I know that I think I really dealt with that, because and for me, I was too involved in external validation, professionally being successful, then as minister of a church and various things I was involved in. So 23 years into our marriage, I did something very painful in our marriage. And that's when we hit a place where either our marriage was going to radically change and improve, or it was going to end. And so for me, what happened is, first of all, individual therapy with somebody. We were living in Scottsdale, or living in the Scottsdale area, and my office in Scottsdale, and I went and saw a therapist in Texas. And I actually called this person up and said somebody I'd heard lecture. All the therapists in Arizona I knew really well. And I called this person up and said, I'd like to buy your weekend. If you're available Saturday and Sunday, I'd like to buy both of those days from you. And the person said, well, I don't do that kind of thing. I see people 1 hour a week. And I said, that's what I do also in my practice. And the person said, well, let's try it and see what happens. And what happened is that for the first time in my life, I really did therapy. I had been in therapy sessions as a client. It was required in my training, and we had done that premarital therapy, but it really never done therapy because so I was broken big time, and a therapist and an ordained minister, and spent 2 days with that person. That really helped, and then more individual therapy, couples therapy, family therapy, to help. And I look at it as a time that I did the most rapid growth. I matured. I was really immature when I got married, and I didn't know that. I don't know what I thought about myself, but I didn't. The way that I found out the dark side of me was through my own actions, and my wife has never said, "I'm sure glad you did what you did." However, she and I both now, 61 years now into the marriage, know that if it hadn't been for something happening, our marriage either we would have stayed married in a marriage that was a bad marriage, not being what it could be, or we would have gotten divorced. And I feel very blessed because Glenda, my wife, re-chose me. And so I have feelings about that now, Andrew, because I certainly did not feel worthy of being re-chosen. And I wasn't worthy in terms of my behavior right then about being re-chosen. And that led to radical surgery in me, where therapists help. My relationship with God, which I don't understand, that is the need never more in my life, that I realized the need I needed help from outside. So therapy, my higher powers, I understand God, and then a wife who has more grace, still does, than I do, and then led to us actually on our 25th anniversary. We had our all-time favorite minister, a guy we worked with him with the vows, and that's when we really had a ceremony and really got emotionally married. And so that story, I don't know whether to say thank you for asking or not, Andrew. Thank you for asking. Has been one of the big elements that lead me to, when I see couples, if it's a heterosexual couple, that every week when I'm at PCS, I hear Glenda, my wife's story. I hear my story. So when it comes to empathy as a therapist for other people, the biggest source of it was my own screw up that leads to caring, and the biggest reason for hope is that here we are 61 years down the road in the best marriage we've ever had, and enjoying our relationship. Not perfect, enjoying our relationship the most we ever have. So I think that hope, by the way, it's a myth to say hope springs eternal. It only springs eternal if hard work is done to deal with whatever needs to be dealt with in the moment.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, one thing that we've talked about before this interview is just as a therapist, it doesn't mean that you're perfect by any means, and it doesn't mean that you don't need to do your own relational work. And how for you, for my dad, for myself, it's that the personal work, the relational work that each of us have engaged with is just like an integral part of our lives, has allowed us to come to that hope, come to relational depth, have grace in our relationships. And so, for all of our listeners, I guess just normalizing going to therapy. I really believe that all therapists need therapy themselves, and another piece of what stood out for me with your story was just that persistence that you've brought into your relationship, and that's been something, as we've talked in recent years, I've realized has been this theme in our family. This value in our family is persistence. in all of our relationships. So I'm very very grateful for you sharing that story, and it rings true with my own personal experience, and moves me to continue with that persistence in my relationship with my wife, and then my relationships with family, and my relationships with my friends as well.
Well, Andrew, I'm 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 glad that you asked the question, and I am uh, so grateful to be able to have your dad basically running, administering PCS, and uh, and to work with him is. I mean, I care for the other therapists to have the father son thing there, and then now to have you as a grandson in the field and studying is very exciting to me, because I can't I that's another blessing. I can't think of anything I'd rather be more meaningful than to be able to help people in areas where I've needed help myself.
Mm.
It's so it's for those who are listening, um, if you're going through something really tough, there's no magic in therapy. There's not a cure in therapy. However, I am a therapist who's been at this for so many years, and value most of all the help it's given me and my wife and my family. And as you're aware, Andrew, your dad and I and you call her Mama, my wife Glenda, and our daughter Michelle, within the last year, had 4 sessions of family therapy. So it's not something that say, okay, I've done that and it's over kind of a thing. I love the term used in the addiction world when we say that we're on lifetime probation. I'm on lifetime probation, and having said that, research indicates that one of the times it's toughest for relationships is when people get married. What I know about myself now is that I know I'd rather be married than not married, and I'm married to the person I most would like to be married to, and that's a incredible blessing.
Indeed.
And very proud of what you're doing, including these podcasts.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So we're coming to the end of our time here. The question I like to end with is what's and it's very fitting for our talk today. What's a message of hope that you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, it's a lot of times people. I mean, every week when I'm at PCS, somebody will say, "Well, I can't do this or I can't do that," and they're not. And the can'ts are based on they haven't done it, and so the psychology of hope sometimes is literally changing words. Because if I keep saying I can't do this, I can't do this. So what I ask people is to quit using the word can't. I mean, there are certain things you can't do, but not the things that usually people are saying can't about. And to use the word choice, because people do choose in many ways, I believe, to screw up. Not that they want to screw up, or that's not who they are as screw-ups. I don't like one of the things with PCS. We use labels at times to help people to get help. At the same time, there's a part of me, and I know some others at PCS, who don't like labels. Who we are is people who are all of us very worthy. So the big deal when it comes to hope is to realize that, by the way, it's one thing I love about the Serenity Prayer. The guy who wrote the Serenity Prayer was a prof of mine back at Harvard Divinity School back from 1960 to 63. And that simple prayer helped me to do what I can do and to let go of what I can't change. And sometimes the letting go of what I can't change is what gets in the way of hope. But changing what I can change includes an enormous amount of things that by changing leads to improved self-esteem and liking and loving self more, which is a fundamental goal in therapy.
Well, it's been such a nice conversation, and thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Well, you're welcome. And Andrew, thank you for doing the podcast.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.